We're going to recap Daniel chapter 2 up to Daniel chapter 6. This is what we have done already. In Daniel 2, in the past, we noticed that kingdoms symbolized in minerals. This is now gold, silver, brass, then iron, then clay plus iron. We have something composite here. And we mentioned that these minerals represent the kingdoms. They represent the kingdoms. According to Daniel chapter 2, they represent the kingdoms. Kingdoms are either kings themselves or their kingdoms. Kings themselves. That's why in Daniel 2 verse 38, you are the head, Nebuchadnezzar. So Babylon is represented by its head. But of interest with these kingdoms, instead of they started up as valuable. The value of gold. Gold is more valuable than silver, brass, and other. Instead of going up in terms of value, they actually go down in terms of value. They become less and less in terms of value. So, of interest, the one that conquers, the one that is represented by gold, is actually less in value. The more they conquer, the message is that the more the kingdoms fight among each other, they become less and less in terms of value. And ultimately, Daniel 2 verse 44, there's a kingdom of stone, or a mountain kingdom, which is bigger, and which is also biblical. All the time, the stone and the rock in the Bible are stronger than the minerals for some reasons. In terms of human value, these are a bit more valuable than the stone. But God does not always link or symbolize himself as, he does not say, I'm gold. He says, oh, you will drink from the rock. Now, if you read, I think it's Psalms 120, verses 1 and 2, where will my help come from? My help will come from God, from the mountains, from the mountain. The help comes from the mountain, and that mountain is also associated with God, who's a helper. And the word that has been used there is the word ezer. The same word in Genesis chapter 2. I will make you a helpmeet, ezer, a helpmeet who's like you, a helper. But this helper is on the mountain. So there was this thinking among the Babylonians that the big gods dwelt on mountains. So this story would make sense to Nebuchadnezzar more than it makes sense to us. Because with us, gold is more precious than stone. But according to the Bible, God is always represented as our rock. They drank from the rock and the stone that was rejected by the builders. And Christ sees himself as that stone. So there is this concept of the stone in Hebrew thinking, which has more value than the minerals. But the kingdoms of the world are represented by the minerals. But the kingdom of God is represented by the mountain. And we know that the mountains do not change, do not move. If you read Psalms 125, 1 and 2, let me read that passage. Psalms 125, quite an interesting, one of my favorite passages. Psalms 125. Okay, found it. It says, I'm reading verse 1 and 2, Psalms 125, verse 1 and 2. Those who trust in the Lord are like Mount Zion. Mountain are like Mount Zion, which cannot be shaken, but endures forever. As, verse 2, I'm reading verse 2. As the mountains surround Jerusalem, so the Lord surrounds his people, both now and forever. God uses the mountain, Mount Zion. Mountain, Mount Zion. And have you noticed mountains are very important in the Old Testament? A mountain used to be a meeting place with God, between Moses and God. Mount Nebo sometimes, Horeb, Mount Sinai. The meeting place would be the mountains. So a mountain plays a significant role among the Babylonians, but also in the Old Testament. No wonder the kingdom is always likened to a mountain and Mount Zion, because the mountains do not change. God moves from one place to another, but the mountain remains. It remains. God is like a mountain. And the verse says, those who trust in the Lord are like Mount Zion. Why? Which cannot be shaken, but endures forever. Now, any other thing can be shaken. Even this one can be shaken. This one can be shaken. This can be shaken. All of this can be shaken. But mountains don't shake. Hellerberg Mountain stands forever. It will only be shaken by the second coming of Christ, maybe. Yes, it will be shaken by the second, but it won't be shaken by the earthquake. Of course, the earthquake might do something to it, but God always, and the mountains have a role, a significant roles among the Israelites, and particularly with Moses. And whenever God would want to meet his children, he would always say, "Come to the foot of the mountain. I will talk to you." And they would be told to dress up nicely, to wash, and come to the mountain and meet God. So the concept of the mountain, both in the New and the Old Testaments, is and it's always associated with God. And later on, or earlier, Moses, the children of Israel would actually drink from the rock. They would drink from the rock. So the gist of the story is the mountain. The mountain. And this mountain represents God who does not change. It also represents the promise of the second coming, which is a mountain which will come and destroy other kingdoms. And this will grow to become a big kingdom. And in this kingdom, 238, it is mentioned that you are the head of the gold. Already there is self-interpretation. And now how do we know this? This silver represents the Medes and the Persians. Daniel chapter 7 and Daniel chapter 8 are very clear on that, in that interpretation. So we find self-interpretation in the passage itself, and we also find it in the thematic parallelisms. You find the interpretation in the thematic parallelisms. Now let's move to chapter 3. Chapter 3, Daniel chapter 3, also assumes chapter 2. There is also an image. But this time this is an image of gold. This is the image of God. Nebuchadnezzar is trying to challenge history, prophecy. And in doing so, he defies the God of Israel. And he also defies his children. And he created fire that would burn 7 times. 7 times. Whatever that means. And this was an extreme fire. Extreme fire. Extreme fire. But then within the fire there is the Son of Gods. Son of the gods. According to Nebuchadnezzar. I see someone who looks like the son of gods. Sons of gods. Let me see. Is it sons or son? Is it in plural form? Doesn't matter. The Son of Gods, sons of gods. Or other translation would say Son of Gods or sons of gods. Whatever. This was Nebuchadnezzar's perspective. And this is a local issue. It's a Babylon issue. It's not an apocalyptic prophecy. It's a local issue. It's a local issue signifying that God is in control. And that even when human beings use extreme measures to undermine him, here he is able to use extreme measures to deliver. When destruction is at its extreme, then deliverance also. Deliverance, it's even more than destruction itself. It's more than destruction itself. So whatever, when he heated fire 7 times, when they emerged, they did not even smell like fire. No smoke, nothing was touched. So extreme measures shows that he's in control, that he cannot be defied. The image of gold cannot defy the God of Israel. And he is able to deliver, he saved his children. Now, chapter 4, I'm going to remove this part here. Chapter 4, it's also the local story, local prophecy. It's not an apocalyptic prophecy. It's not an apocalyptic. The events of Daniel chapter 4 have no global significance. They have no global significance. But they do have local significance. They do have local significance. It shows that the story here talks to the children of Israel. That although they are in captivity, he can actually capture the king. He can. Nebuchadnezzar is still under his control. And how does the story unfold? The story unfolds in a dream. The dream, Nebuchadnezzar remembered the dream. He remembered it. But he needed interpretation. His question was, what is the meaning of this? The tree, its leaves and fruits, plus its shade, protecting people. But then the tree is cut and bound by brass. What is the meaning of this? The person who comes to cut and it's the heavenly watcher. Nebuchadnezzar wanted to know who this person is. What is the meaning of this? So he needed the interpretation to this. Needed interpretation. So Daniel came to interpret the dream. And the story, as we've mentioned, it has a local significance. It doesn't mean anything to people who live outside of Babylon. But then this story introduces the year-day principle. Year-day principle. The application of year-day principle is introduced, where you find 7 times. 7 times. Which refers to 7 years. This is prophetic. 7 times is prophetic. 7 years translates to literal years. Literal years. But then the story is also the story of God's grace. God's grace. Because after the prophecy, Daniel said, King, this is the interpretation. You are that tree. All nations find protection in you. They find sustenance in you. But because you did not practice justice, God is going to punish you. And that punishment is going to be for 7 times. And we read from the story that it took 12 months before fulfillment. 12 months before fulfillment. Let me see if I can find that verse where this is now chapter 4, verse 27, where Daniel speaks to the king. Therefore, chapter 12, verse 27, therefore, O king, be pleased to accept my advice. Renounce your sins by doing what is right, and renounce your wickedness by being kind to the oppressed. It may be that your prosperity will continue. Verse 28 says, all this happened to King Nebuchadnezzar. 29, 12 months later, as the king was walking on the roof of the royal palace of Babylon, he said, is not this the great Babylon I built as the royal residence by my might, by my mighty power, and for the glory of my majesty? And the verse 31 says, the words were still on his lips when a voice came from heaven. This is what is decreed for you, King Nebuchadnezzar. You will be driven away from your people. And the rest is it's history. Verse 28 mentions that, verse 29, Daniel 4, verse 29, that this prophecy of 7 times would be fulfilled 12 months later, giving the impression that God gave him grace to think about it. But later on, it says, when Nebuchadnezzar looked up to God, when he looked up to God, then he regained his consciousness. Verse 34 says, chapter 4, verse 34, it says, at the end of that time, I, Nebuchadnezzar, raised my eyes toward heaven, and my sanity was restored. When he looked up, he was restored. But when he looked down to what he had done, he became an animal. I think there's a moral story to this. When we look at what we have done, we become animals. When we look at the glories, the might that we have, our devices, this is what we have done, we become animals. But when we lift up our eyes and see God, we actually are restored. He was given 12 months and he did not change. He did not take Daniel's advice. He did not renounce his sins. He did not stop practicing wickedness. He did not do what is right. Although he was even given 12 months to do that. But when he repented, when he looked up, then he was restored. It shows God's grace, even at our extreme. Even when we did not listen, he restores us. But there is something about this story which scholars have challenged. OT scholars have challenged the stories. They have challenged the historicity of the story. The historicity of this event. They even challenged the authorship of the story, of the book. The authorship, because Nebuchadnezzar speaks in the first person in this chapter. And historicity, the chronicles, the Babylonian chronicles, do not record this incident of Daniel chapter 4. And because of that, they are challenging. Daniel, you are the only source of the story. Why? Where do you get this information? Because history does not back you up. And it appears that this story was written by Nebuchadnezzar. Now, these are the 20th century scholars who are questioning this, the authorship of the book. They're actually using the style of writing in the 20th century. They impose it in the 21st century. Normally, chapter 1 up to chapter 6 are written in the first person, largely, all of them. Where Daniel is speaking, or Daniel allows Nebuchadnezzar to speak, Daniel writes. That was the normal style back then. So the historicity, this was, archaeology came up with explained this, because they discovered an inscription which had the history of Nebuchadnezzar, which says, at some point Nebuchadnezzar abandoned his throne and he went out. He did not care about the kingdom. He lived like an animal, but later on he came back. So someone else outside of Daniel wrote about that, a person who lived during that time. And archaeology proved the historicity of the book of. So this problem has been solved. The authorship, once we apply the style of writing, then it's no longer an issue at all. So chapter 4 has some theoretical challenges, but those challenges are not, those are minor challenges. Another chapter is chapter 5 of the book of Daniel. Chapter 5 of the book of Daniel. Chapter 5 of the book of Daniel. It's a story of Belshazzar. Story of Belshazzar. Daniel chapter 5. Daniel chapter 5. Maybe let's start with the challenges that have been raised in Daniel chapter 5. The challenges are around Belshazzar himself. Belshazzar himself. The question is, who was this Belshazzar? Because we don't read much about him. The person that we read about is Nabonidus. Nabonidus. I hope Nabonidus. I hope the spelling is correct. This name is captured in Persian chronicles. He was one of the generals of the Medes and the Persians. No. He was the general after Nebuchadnezzar, after the death of Nebuchadnezzar. Oh, what a mistake, Nebuchadnezzar. After the death of Nebuchadnezzar. Remember, we last saw Nebuchadnezzar in Daniel chapter 4. In Daniel chapter 5, Nebuchadnezzar is no more. His grandchild is in charge, Belshazzar. But according to the according to the Babylonian chronicles, actually, even the Medes and the Persians chronicles also record that when the Medes and the Persians attacked Babylon, the person who was in charge was this one, but they don't mention Belshazzar. Both Babylonian and the Medes and the Persian chronicles refer to Nabonidus, not Belshazzar. Now the question is, why Daniel has this story? So Daniel becomes the only source who says Babylon was under Belshazzar. when the Medes and the Persians attacked Babylon, Belshazzar was in charge. So what's the proof? Actually, they are questioning the historicity of the book of Daniel. The book of Daniel. Again, archaeology, as always. I hope the spelling is correct. Somewhere there must be A somewhere. Archaeology, or the spade, has again proved that actually Belshazzar was in charge of Babylon. But the rest of the kingdom, other kingdoms that had been conquered, Nebuchadnezzar was the one in charge. This one was only in Babylon. Nebuchadnezzar spent most of his time in Arabia, and it is recorded that he spent almost 10 years there. By the time the Medes and the Persians attacked Babylon, he managed to come and rescue, but by the time he got there, it had been taken already. So, chronicles refer to Nebuchadnezzar, to not only Daniel, but archaeology has proved that during the time when Nebuchadnezzar was in charge of Babylon, he was in charge of the entire kingdom of the Babylonians. The capital city, the seat of government, the city of Babylon itself, Belshazzar was in charge of that. He was simply in charge of the city, but Nebuchadnezzar, the general, was in charge of the entire, all the places. So archaeology solves this problem and proves the historicity of the book. Proves that Daniel was actually accurate in writing that. Another important thing in Daniel chapter 5, we also read about the writing of the wall, the writing on the wall. That writing on the wall where commercial language is used. Commercial language is used. And it uses the grams to measure. You have been measured and you are simply 1 kilogram. 1 kilogram. And in other words, you are wanting. You have been put on the scales and you are wanting. You are wanting. And your kingdom has been given to the Medes and the Persians. And the concept of the balances. The concept of the balances, it's an Old Testament concept where God uses balances, where God weighs his people, puts them on the scales, on the scale, to determine their weight. So it gives us the impression that God actually does not count, but he weighs. He weighs. So based on your weight, then you are judged. So judgment is based on weight. Now, Old Testament examples. David, after some time, decided to evaluate his army. The passage said he counted his army and God was upset with him. God said, "Why are you counting your army?" David, I just wanted to check if I'm strong enough against other nations. And God said, "Don't you trust me anymore? Do you think I work with the numbers?" And God punished David for counting or evaluating or taking a consensus of his army. We also read the story of Gideon. The story of Gideon in the book of Judges, where God used only 300 people to fight against 6 nations. And he reduced the numbers. He reduced the numbers to 300. Versus 6 nations. Why? Because God weighed them. 300 of them tipped the balances. Their faith, so because the understanding is they don't have to fight. God is the one who's fighting. The battle belongs to the Lord. You are simply witnesses. So in this story, you have been weighed, put on the balances, and you are very wanting. You have been found wanting. You are weightless. You are weak. And then judgment. Another chapter 6. Let's go to chapter 6. Chapter 6. Maybe just to wrap chapter 5. Just to wrap chapter 5. Chapter 5, it's also parallel to Daniel chapter 4. In the sense that judgment comes from God for both chapter 4 and chapter 5. Judgment comes from God. You have that thematic parallelism. But you also have verbal parallelism between Daniel chapter 2 and Daniel chapter 5, where in chapter 2 you also have gold, silver, brass, and iron. And you have clay here, and you have clay plus iron. In chapter 5, you have gold, you have silver, you have brass, you have iron, but then you have wood. These are parallel, the words are parallel. The words are parallel, but when you come here, they are not parallel. But the majority of them are parallel. In chapter 5, it is referring to idols. In chapter 2, it is referring to kingdoms. So words are the same, but meanings are not the same. You have that parallelism. Also the judgment, that is the judgment by God in chapter 4 to Nebuchadnezzar, in chapter 5 to Belshazzar. So you have that parallelism. Okay? I think we can move this, we can remove this and go to chapter 6. Chapter 6, it's also a judgment of some sort. It's also a judgment. But this judgment comes from Darius. It comes from Darius. And the victim of the judgment is Daniel himself. And the occasion for this is emperor worship. I'm going to use this phrase, emperor worship, because this is going to be significant as we go to the book of Revelation. Or in the first century, where emperor worship was very much significant. But the roots thereof started in the book of Daniel. Emperor worship. This was the occasion of Daniel chapter 6. The instruction was given that everyone for the whole month should worship King Darius. And the occasion was also linked to a trap that was placed on Daniel, knowing that Daniel will not worship the king, he worships his God. He put a trap, and they used extreme measures also, extreme punishment. They used extreme punishment for Daniel, and God had to use extreme deliverance. And in both cases, they are lions. He was supposed to be eaten by lions, but he was delivered from lions. Lions themselves, delivered from them. And And chapter 6, it's also significant because it's the time of the needs and the patience. And Daniel is also part of the kingdom. It's part of this kingdom. And God delivers them. And also the theme of judgment, it's also repeated. The theme of God is in control. God is in control. It's also repeated. It's also repeated. The theme of remnant, it's also repeated. Also repeated. It was introduced and it is repeated. It's a local matter. It has no apocalyptic significance. It's a local matter, but it proves that God is in control, and that God can use extreme measures when extreme measures have been used against his children, even in a local environment. But it also has prophetic significance in that in future, this would become an issue, emperor worship. Emperor worship would become an issue in the book of Revelation and during the seven churches of Revelation. This would become an issue, a significant issue in emperor worship. But the roots thereof, the seeds thereof, are planted right in Daniel chapter 6, very early, in the context of putting a trap and destroying Daniel. But God, as always, because he's in control, he would use extreme measures to save Daniel. And Daniel, it's again glorified. Now, after every event, there is always a promotion. Always a promotion. Daniel is promoted. This time he's very old, but he gets promotion after that event. God does not only deliver, he also restores and rewards. Now, I want us to move to chapter 7 of the book of Daniel. It's a new section. I want us to move to a new section, Daniel chapter 7. Daniel chapter 7.